Originally from New York, but I've been living in North Carolina again since 1973.
And how'd you get in the military?
Well, I was in high school in 1965, and I saw a newspaper headline, Marines land at Da Nang. And everybody in my family were Marines. And so I knew right then, right there, plans that everybody made for me for college were finished. So I went home that day and told my parents I was going to enlist in the Marine Corps. And my mother got real upset with me, said, "You have a scholarship, go to school." I said, "I can go to school when I get out." And she says, "No, I'm not going to sign for you." And I said, "Well, you can sign for me now at 17 and let me go with your blessings, or I'll enlist when I'm 18 and don't need it. You'll never see me again." So my father said, "If you're that determined, I will sign for you." So I enlisted at 17 in the Marine Corps.
What was your rank in the Marine Corps?
When I got out, I was a sergeant.
So now that she knew you were getting in, whether you liked it or not, but what was it like when she? Obviously, I'm sure she knew you were going to Vietnam, but what was that like saying, "Yep, I'm going over"?
Well, I had volunteered for Vietnam, and to my dismay, they gave me a different duty station. They were going to station me in North Carolina, and I knew that was going to be a 2-year stint. So I said, "Well, I need a car." So I took $5,000 out of the bank, and I had an appointment with Gotham Ford, New York City, and they were the Shelby dealer. I was going to test drive a Shelby GT350 or a 427 Cobra. Cobra was $7,200, the Mustang was $5,900, and I had $5,000 cash that I was going to put on. And the morning I was getting ready to go, my mother says, "Bob, you got a telegram." And I said, "Well, I'll read it later. I'm on my way to test drive these 2 cars." And she says, "No, I think it's important." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the telegram's addressed to PFC Patrikios." And so I knew the only one that called me that was the Marine Corps, and they changed my orders from duty station in North Carolina to report to California Camp Pendleton for duty with ground forces in Westpac, which was Vietnam. So I put my money back in the bank and wish I would have bought that car now, because it would have been worth millions.
What was your service like over there? What did you get to have to do?
I was one of the few very unique people that knew what we were fighting for in Vietnam. In the 20s and 30s, the Marine Corps was involved in the banana wars down in South America, Nicaragua, Haiti. And so they had a good idea how to fight a guerrilla war. They would take a few Marines, stick them with the local troops, and it was a great combination because the local troops knew where the enemy was and the Marines knew how to fight, so they complemented one another. So the Marine Corps decided they were going to try that again. In 1965, they formed the first Combined Action Company. They would take a squad of Marines, normally supposed to be 15 to 16, but in reality it was 10 to 12, and they would stick them in the village with a squad, I should say a platoon of Vietnamese Piets. They were farmers in the daytime and soldiers by night. They weren't really soldiers. Calling them soldiers would be a sin. And the Marines taught them everything they needed to know about defending their village, how to set up ambushes and patrolling to keep the enemy out. And in the daytime, the Marines would help them with civic projects, digging a well, help building a school. And at night, they'd go out there, they were wear 2 hats. They could be stone cold killers in an ambush and a compassionate person helping a midwife deliver a baby. So when a reporter asked our colonel one day, how would you describe your men? And he said they're Peace Corps with guns. So that basically really the way it was. And from that one, they jumped to 13, and I was lucky enough to be in one of the original 13 cap units. And the program was so effective that in 1967, cap units accounted for less than 3% of the combat troops in Northern I Corps, and yet we accounted for 43% of the enemy kills. So we were hurting them very, very badly. In fact, during the Tet Offensive, each NVA unit and VC unit, they were given a designated target. Any cap unit that was in their area was to be wiped out. So we knew we were really hurting them. The Cap Marines had the highest retention rate of extending their tours in Vietnam because they knew what they were fighting for. They weren't fighting for the Saigon government or the U.S. government. They were fighting for the Marine next to them and the rice farmers who they were protecting. These Marines were 18, 19 years old, and most of them had girlfriends. And these families adopted these young Marines. And so it became a very, very personal war. And they were no longer protecting some Vietnamese villager. They were protecting friends and family. And their attitude became, to get to them, you got to go through us. The casualty rates were very, very high in the cap units. In fact, from 65 to 71, when the cap units were disbanded, there was 5,260 Marines involved in the program. Out of the 5,260, only 2,236 came home, took over 50% killed in country. And of the ones that did make it out, a high percentage of them committed suicide. They had survivor guilt. The Marine Corps had no idea the personal bond that was going to affect these young Marines with these villagers. And so it was very hard to readjust back here in the States. In fact, most Marines that were in the cap unit tried to go back to Vietnam, and I myself, and they said, no, you've had enough. So that's why I can honestly say I knew what I was fighting for. So did all these other cap Marines.
What, you went over a lot there, and you said a lot of things. What does it mean to you to see the faces of those people, those families that you were over there helping? What are those personal stories for you?
I would really, really like to go back and visit the villages that I served in. I had served in 3 different villages. What would happen, you would be stationed in the village, and you would train the PFs to the point that they could literally defend their own village by themselves. So we would work ourselves out of a job and go to a new village. We weren't like the Green Berets where you'd go out and 3 months later they'd take you back and stick you in a rear area. The Cap Marine went out to a village. The only time he left is when he did his job and taught those PFs. His time was up, which was very rare, or when he was killed. But the majority of Cap Marines didn't want to leave their villages. In fact, it got to the point where they would never tell these Marines when they were due to go home, because they would go hide out, figuring, and them thinking that if they can't find me, they're going to let me stay here. And so these guys that hang out, but they never told you in the end. In fact, they'll come and snatch you up the night before you're supposed to leave. They had 2 people assigned to me, took me to the rear, turned in all my gear, got whatever shots I needed, and they stayed with me till I got on a plane the next morning, because they were having such a problem with Cap Marines not going home.
like for you? You know, you get put on a plane, you put all that effort in over there.
What was it like? I hated the government, what they were doing. General Westmoreland fought the Marine generals tooth and nail about what the Marines were doing with these cap units. General Westmoreland had these grand illusion of a big battle like World War II, and he was going to defeat the NVA Army. You know, he did that. Look what he did at Quezon, stuck those Marines up there. Marines are not garrison troops. They're shock troops. They're combat troops. You don't stick them someplace to get shelled every day and not give them the opportunity. He misused the Marine Corps, basically, is what he did. And he fought them tooth and nail, would not allocate any extra manpower for cap units or material. So it's a hard thing to say that a lot of cap units had to depend on what they could steal, because nobody would give them any supplies. You know, it's a hell of a note. You would go down to Graves registration and take clothes and boots from dead Marines because yours were rotting away, and you look at these rear area troops wearing all brand new jungle boots and jungle utilities. It was sort of disheartening. And so we became very good scroungers. And I mean, somebody once said about me, if you stand still long enough and you got gold teeth, you'll have them out of your mouth before you know it. I was very good at what I did.
First, you're battling kind of your own sideline there, with trying to get what you need, and you come home, and what was that like, transitioning back to the States?
The first week I was volunteering to go back to Vietnam. This was no longer home to me. I saw the way the country was, and I said, this is not the home I left. I said, I left home, you know, a week ago. And a lot of Marines felt that way, especially the Cap Marines did. That was home. In fact, we've had a lot of guys, once they get out of the Marine Corps, they're living in Thailand and places like that and go back to Vietnam. So it was very, very emotional, and they had no idea how emotional it was going to be. The survivor guilt was tremendous. I don't know how many deaths were caused by it. You know, why am I alive? My best friends died. But we knew what we were fighting for, so I can say, yeah, I have good feelings about what I did in Vietnam. You know, I don't know about everybody else, because, you know, let's face it, Cap Marines were isolated. You lived in a village. And most of these villagers had never traveled more than 20 miles from their village in a lifetime. That was their home. Their relatives were buried there. So it was a very special place to them. And when, you know, the Saigon government would try to relocate them to these safe hamlets, you know, it destroyed them spiritually. And that's another thing that some of the village chiefs and district chiefs did not like. Most of these villagers, they were sharecroppers. They were built, you know, growing the crops, and the landowner was supposed to get, say, 10%. And if the district chief or province chief was bribed, you know, they would charge these little villages as much as 50%. So here he loses half his crop, and here comes the VC. And they're going to take whatever they can, and these people are not, don't have enough food to feed their families. So when you stuck a cap unit in there, the whole game changed. No longer could corrupt officials say, we're going to do this. We would stand there and say, no, this is what you're taking, because we didn't have to play by anybody's rules. In fact, a lot of Marine Corps officers didn't like Cap Marines because they had no jurisdiction over us. You know, you had a corporal or a sergeant in charge of a unit, no officers out there. So we would run pretty freely. and the government could plausibly deny what we do, you know, and we got the job done. But, you know, anytime you mix a politician in a war, you're going to lose the war. And that's what happened in Vietnam. Militarily, we could have kicked their butt in 6 months if they would have turned us loose. But when you had the president saying, you know, they can't bomb an outhouse in North Vietnam unless I authorize it, you know, right then and there, you're doomed. But the Marine Corps proved that cap units worked in Vietnam.
What does it mean to you when you see the Vietnam Memorial now? What's that mean to you?
It took me a few years to go there. I was not ready to face my ghosts. I have a lot of friends on the wall, and as long as I'm alive, they're remembered. And as long as my son's alive, they're remembered. So I'm glad they did the wall. They could do without that statue that, you know, that's a bunch of baloney right there, but the wall is great.
Telling your story today, why do you feel it was important to share in your story and want to pass this along?
Because there were programs that worked in Vietnam, and the Combined Action Program was at the top of the list of what worked in Vietnam. There were, a Cap Marine was killed. I'll give you an example. There was one Cap Marine that was killed in this one hamlet, and he was so loved by the people. 5,000 villagers came out to mourn him. And they were so upset with the VC for killing him that they would no longer be tolerated in their village. So we did something good there.